Hi Nico. So we've been asking throughout the season what intelligence is to dozens of different people. And also, of course, what makes something, an organism, an artificial system and so on, intelligent. And we got very different answers.
Absolutely. And sometimes we didn't even get any answer at all because people just didn't want to answer.
Could you tell us, what is intelligence?
No.
I guess we cannot really blame anyone here, right? So intelligence just seems to be something that appears in so many different contexts and has so many different senses. So it's very difficult to pin down exactly, how we should talk about this notion and what it actually means. So it's difficult to blame them for this, right? For refusing to answer or thinking that perhaps giving an answer to that specific question is not, the central or the most important thing. Anyways, today we're going to look at some cases that may seem particularly strange to talk about when we talk about intelligence, right? So we're going to talk about some edge cases when it comes to the question of what counts as intelligent. Especially where should we draw the line between what is intelligent and what is not? Is there such a line? Where does it, go? Where does it cross the animal kingdom? So that's what we are going to be talking about today, if I get you correctly, Nico, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So, I'm Dimitri Mollo.
And I'm Nicolas Roth by the Science of Intelligence cluster in Berlin. This is Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent.
As we've seen over the last episodes, it's already quite hard to say what we mean by intelligence when talking just about humans. But us, hairless apes, are by far not the only animals to show intelligent behavior, as we've seen. And even some animals, which appear to be quite limited in what they can do, can actually show incredibly impressive behavior when, for example, they are put in a group, in a collective.
Right, and it doesn't even stop there. We also talked about how increasing computing power, clever algorithms, and elegantly designed robots lead to increasingly impressive results in artificial intelligence.
So with a concept so broad and hard to pin down, there is always the danger of it just becoming an empty phrase, an empty term that doesn't really mean much. I guess, however, that we can agree that pretty much all humans are somewhat intelligent. But also all animals, maybe even plants, bacteria, or cells?
There's a similar argument to be had in artificial intelligence. If we had a robot that could do anything that a human can do, we would probably have no problem calling that machine intelligent. But what about systems that can do only very few things, like playing chess, which are often called narrow AI? Is this still intelligence? Or, for example, how about a thermostat?
That might sound silly, but a thermostat does check quite a few boxes. It senses the state of its environment. It has an internal desired state, so the temperature that you set it to and that it tries to achieve. And it then computes the difference between perception, so how the room is now, what the temperature is, and desire, what it wants, so to speak, the temperature to become. And uses that to solve the problem of maintaining the specific room temperature that you set.
Yeah, on the other hand, just because that fulfills some of the criterions that we think intelligence should have, maybe that doesn't really tell so much about the intelligence of the thermostat, but really more about our pretty poor criterions and definitions.
Yeah, that sounds fair enough. But anyways, this is what we have experts in our podcast for.
Right, and this is why today we look into the tree of life and discuss where it really makes sense to talk about intelligence and what the good criteria really are. We will encounter some radical ideas and pretty mind-boggling experiments that show some unbelievable capacities of pretty simple organic systems.
Well, what counts as intelligent? If I play hide and seek with someone and we are trying to hide behind a bush and that someone says, "No, don't go there, you can be seen from the side," then I'd say, yes, this is very intelligent.
Well, according to me, what counts as intelligent is the ability of an individual to apply the knowledge in real-time situations, or in other words, applying our common sense.
So intelligence is a word that is used to describe mental performance. But if you look into the details about how it's historically been used, it's incredibly diverse. If you look into intelligence tests, for example, it's not clear whether these intelligence tests really capture.
Intelligence is an agent's autonomous problem-solving capacity.
Intelligence is recognizing rules in an unknown system and make them work for you.
Intelligence is the ability to learn from your environment and use that to make predictions or plans for the future.
Welcome back to Punching Cards. Today we have Solveig in the studio. Many thanks for joining.
My pleasure.
As we've heard, there are so many different takes on what it really is that makes a human or an animal or basically anything intelligent. And now we're already in the 6th episode of our podcast, and it seems like we still don't really have a definition of the very thing that we are always talking about. So if we don't even know what to look for, how do we know where to look for it?
I guess different people and disciplines have very different answers to that. Most psychologists look for intelligence by investigating the human mind and behavior. Behavioral biologists show us how clever other animals can be, and most roboticists have no problem calling their creations intelligent. And experts today look for intelligence where only few people would expect it.
Yeah, that's great. I wonder if they can really provide us now with a definition for it.
Well,
the answer is not that I cannot, but that I shouldn't.
So this was Paco Calvo, professor of philosophy of science and author of the newly released book Planta Sapiens, the new science of plant intelligence.
I'm Paco Calvo. I direct the Minimal Intelligence Lab, MINT Lab, at the University of Murcia in Spain. And I'm a philosopher, which makes things a bit more exciting because I'm a philosopher of plant science. So this is kind of, sounds like difficult to swallow at first sight, but it does make sense. And it makes sense because we try to raise the type of questions that you wouldn't hear in a plant biology course, like mainstream or orthodox plant biology course for plant biology students, widening, opening the broad of questions that we are able to ask, right? So that's what we do. We are sort of in between the biology, the psychology, the cognitive sciences, the neurosciences, the robotics, the artificial intelligence, any field whatsoever that has something that any type of light they can throw upon the understanding of plant life and plant intelligence, right?
Paco and his team stepped out of traditional academic disciplines and started to ask questions about plant intelligence, which is at the intersection of biology, philosophy, and cognitive science, which are as intriguing as they are controversial.
Yeah, that's great. But I can imagine that not everybody is really on board with that idea that plants might have cognition or intelligence. But if we think about that, wouldn't it be good to have one definition of intelligence, and if an organism fulfills that criterion, it is intelligence, and if not, then, well, it's not? Isn't that a clear way to distinguish that?
Well, there are two big problems with that.
Any definition of intelligence that we might try to apply pre-theoretically might be biased, might be too biased towards the type of intelligence that by default we think that should apply to other forms of life insofar that it applies to ourselves.
Yeah, I can totally see that bias issue. One of many good examples for such a bias is actually also in artificial intelligence research, where for a long time people considered playing chess as a measure for progress and intelligence. But that is, of course, a very biased human thing to think of. And to quote the influential AI researcher Rodney Brooks, elephants don't play chess, and it would be very unfair to claim that an elephant has no intelligence worth studying just because it doesn't play chess, right?
Right. And the other problem is that definitions can actually hinder scientific progress.
We are far too used to setting definitions in stone and then try to make progress out of some definition that we are not going to question throughout the whole project, right? So you move on from, okay, let's define intelligence is this, and that. And then we we design a set of experimental designs, we make this project, and then we never go back and revise our definition. So we become enslaved by the type of definitions that we are using. And that's why I resist myself to providing one single definition that, like, okay, sets the stage.
And maybe this question of whether something is intelligent or not is not the right question to ask after all.
I don't accept the dichotomy of intelligence versus lack of intelligence, right? So that's actually very important, because when people do the same thing with cognition, with consciousness, with many things. And once you do that, you basically have made the assumption of a binary variable, right? You're saying that something either is or is not. And I think this is fundamentally a mistake. It leads to all kinds of pseudo problems and all kinds of issues. So to me, the question is, for any given system, the question is what kind of intelligence it has and how much. And it may be very little, but it's always, to me, that's always a continuous measure, not a binary thing.
This was Professor Michael Levin from Tufts University. He is the director of the Allen Discovery Center and Tufts Center for Regenerative and Developmental Biology.
My background is originally in computer science. I did some software engineering. I did my undergraduate degree first in computer science and then in biology, and PhD in genetics. My group right now works on a number of issues related to decision making, in particular problem solving among cellular collectives. So it's very much at the intersection of cognitive science, computer science, and developmental biology. So we're interested in how cells and cell groups make decisions in various spaces. This is, anatomical space and physiological space and so on.
Exciting stuff. I guess cellular collectives are also not really on everybody's list on what counts as intelligent.
Yet.
But before we go into that, if pretty much everything is more or less intelligent, what is the value of asking how intelligent a system is in the first place?
Just why is it important for us as scientists to have a correct level of intelligence estimate for various things? There's this idea of Morgan's canon, which is this idea that you should ascribe the least amount of intelligence to any process that you possibly can, right? To describe it in the most mechanistic terms possible. And the problem with that is that it goes only in one direction. So people are really afraid of making the mistake of ascribing too much agency to things. But it's a kind of teleophobia that I call it, which that people are really afraid to kind of go overboard in that direction. But it's actually just as bad to go in the other direction, and to miss a kind of intelligence that exists in your system that you don't see. And as scientists and as engineers, it's exactly the same issue of prediction and control. If you have a ball sitting at the top of a hill, you'd be pretty successful in using, let's say, Newton's laws to figure out where it's going to go. If you have a mouse at the top of the hill, those will be hopeless, and you need something completely different. And so to be able to control and predict complex systems, it helps to have the right level of cognition and intelligence ascribed to the system, not too much, not too little, but exactly the amount that gives you the most optimal insight into what the system is going to do next and how you can relate to it, how you may control it, how you may communicate with it, whatever it's going to be. That our job as scientists, I think, is to pick out the right level of agency for any organism.
And he also points out that being good at such predictions has given us evolutionary advantages. So maybe the search for intelligence is rooted deeply in our evolution.
Yeah, I mean, as someone working on intelligence, I really love that idea. But coming back to Morgan's canon and always looking for the least advanced description of any behavior, I can imagine that Paco finds this concept problematic too.
Right. This came up when we were talking about whether plants are capable of making decisions.
So, if you are not in the business of making predictions, you are doomed. You cannot simply be waiting for things to happen to you and then, oh shit, what should I do? You've got to anticipate states of uncertainty. You've got to be at the wheel. You've got to be sitting at the wheel and take decisions. Plants don't make choices. They simply grow towards the light. They say, how do you mean? And if you see an animal making decisions, taking choices, well, they have A, B. When plants do it, plants can grow one way. They can grow another way. When plants do it, we say, no, it's just a physiological matter. For example, plant phototropic behavior. They grow towards the source of light because it's food to them, right? Now, that's a mistake because that would mean that plant behavior would be purely reactive. And this is a working hypothesis. I'm not saying this is correct. I don't mean to say it as set in stone. is precisely why I don't want to give a definition. So if plant life happens to proceed along these lines, then this is the type of experimental designs we should be making to try to unearth that or to try to test those working hypotheses, right? If plausibly enough, they need to deal with future states of affairs and they need to do it in a flexible enough manner, then how could we test for the possibility that they are anticipating those states of affairs? Now, this is a question that we are able to raise in the first place, remember, because we are not doing it from a plant biology department. They wouldn't be doing this. So I'm juggling with all these concepts in a way that avoids setting definitions in stone.
True, but now I'm wondering, what does Mike say about defining the term intelligence?
I think he found a way that also Paco would agree with.
I think it has nothing to do with what you're made of. It doesn't require brains. It doesn't require specific kinds of synapses, nothing like that. Those are all contingent facts. I think that a useful general definition of intelligence has to do with the ability to solve problems in some appropriate space. And that's the important part, is that the space could be almost anything. In other words, it could be the familiar three-dimensional space, in which case you're dealing with a kind of behavioral intelligence. You're watching the kind of behavior that we're used to when we talk about intelligent animals and birds and things like that. But it can also be other spaces. It could be a metabolic space, it could, as bacteria do. It could be physiological space. It could be anatomical space, which is what my group at the Allen Discovery Center works on. So intelligence is the degree of competency with which you navigate a particular space to solve problems in an adaptive way. Right? That would be my definition of intelligence.
That makes sense. But what kinds of problems are collectives or cells solving?
Well, developing a normal organism can already be a very challenging problem, at least for the cells in Mike's lab.
This has to do with a process that we study called anatomical homeostasis. So if you take, just as one example, there are many examples, but here's one example. If you take a tadpole of a frog, and tadpoles, they need to become frogs, and so to become frogs, they have to rearrange their face. So the eyes have to move forward, the jaws have to move, everything has to move. And so what we found is that if you create a tadpole where all of the organs are in abnormal starting positions, okay, so the eyes are on the back of the head, the jaws are off to the side, everything is off. All of these individual pieces will move in novel paths, and sometimes they even go too far and have to come back, but they'll all rearrange until you get to a pretty normal frog. Now, this is a single system solving a problem in morphospace, meaning that it matches William James's definition of intelligence, as in being able to achieve your goal despite different starting states and different perturbations along the way. So this is a basal intelligence that's able to, you've deformed it to a different region of that space, and it can still find its way through novel paths to where it wants to go.
So individual cells follow quite simple rules, but through communication, they achieve really remarkable behavior.
Now, it also happens to be a collective intelligence because it's made up of cells and tissues. We are also a collective intelligence. We're bags of neurons, right? So every intelligence is a collective intelligence. And this is not an evolutionary process. Evolution has given us some hardware that is able to execute this amazing process, basically in software, guided by decision-making along the way, that is able to solve new problems in morphospace.
So it's not only that we as an individual are intelligent, we're also made of intelligence.
Exactly, and that view opens up some totally new research questions.
It helps us to interact with the system better to get better prediction and control. So in my lab, we work on applications such as regenerative medicine, trying to grow and repair organs, reprogram tumors, fix birth defects, these kinds of things. When you do this, having the right level of interaction with the system is really important, because if you accept the standard assumptions of molecular medicine, you basically are forced to interact with the system at the hardware level. You're editing genes, you're rewiring pathways. It's the way we used to program computers in the 50s. You physically have to change the hardware. You have to rewire the hardware. That's okay, and you can achieve certain things that way. But nowadays, when you switch from Photoshop to Microsoft Word, you don't get out your soldering iron. Why not? Because we figured out that if your hardware is good enough, you can interact with it by experiences, by inputs that you provide, right? You can program at the level of software. You don't have to rewire the machine. And so this is an extremely powerful abstraction that we've used in our work. Once you understand what the capabilities of the system are in terms of what is it measuring, what is it optimizing, what are the motivations, when you know these things, you can interact with it at a much higher level. You can get it to do things without understanding or knowing what all the lowest level components are doing. And in fact, that means you can reach very complex outcomes with fairly little input of complexity. You can trigger very complex subroutines. Right. So that aspect of programming at the right level is really critical, and it offers us all kinds of new capacities that we've shown in the lab as far as triggering organ regeneration, reprogramming tumors, repairing birth defects of the head and face, and so on, that are very difficult with other approaches.
And the better we understand the behavior of these collectives, the better we might understand our own behavior.
This early developmental bioelectricity that we work on, this idea that all cells in your body are forming electrical networks that process information, not just your brain does that. Understanding how that works, first of all, provides a simplified context for understanding cognition and neuroscience. So maybe we crack that first before we crack the problem of the brain. And second, it helps us to really understand, why is there so much overlap between processes involved in morphogenesis and processes involved in behavior? Well, that's because they're both solving a kind of problem, and so it may help us understand some of these things.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love this separation of biological hardware encoded in the DNA of cells, and then the software, the communication between the cells, which we can interact with and reprogram essentially like a computer software. This could give us a super powerful tool, right? I'm wondering how close this metaphor really is to reality.
Right. According to Mike, every description of reality is some sort of a metaphor. The only question is, how much use and understanding do we get out of it?
I want to be clear. I'm certainly not making the claim that living things are like the kinds of computers that you and I deal with on a daily basis. That's obviously not true. But there are fundamental truths of computer science that are, I think, really powerful for biology. And it's people often do freak out when you compare living things to biology and to living things in biology to computers. And they say, oh, that's just the favorite technology of the day. We used to think things were like steam engines, and then we thought they were like mechanical pulleys before that, and so on. Actually, it's funny because the more that's a naive, I think, interpretation of that phenomenon. I think we certainly learned a lot of things from steam engines having to do with entropy and basic physics that are absolutely true of life. And it's not because living things are like steam engines. It's because both things are examples of laws of thermodynamics. And I think the same is true of computers. I think the point isn't to say that we're like computers. The point is the computation is a powerful metaphor, and it has lots of things of use for us here.
Can you give an example then where this reprogramming metaphor is especially useful?
Sure. Mike has a whole number of crazy experiments that are pretty much impossible to explain by just looking at the hardware.
Okay, so structurally, everybody knows that biology is hierarchical, right? Organs are made of tissues, are made of cells, and so on and so on. That's structural, that's obvious. Just as a simple example, when you take an eye from a tadpole and you put that eye, you move that eye in the embryo, you move it to the tail, okay? Those animals can still see perfectly well. Why? Because the new cells finding themselves at the tail, they still know how to make an eye, and they do. And then the optic nerve comes out, and it's sort of, it wants to hook up to the biggest sort of neural path that it can find, so it finds the spinal cord, and it attaches to the spinal cord. And so that information gets up to the brain, and the brain sort of knows how to do this predictive loop and this input-output relation, and so it gets these data. Okay, so they come from a different place, fine. And so that plasticity is incredibly important, because think about evolution. It means that every time you make a mutation that moves some stuff around, you don't automatically, your behavior doesn't just fall apart and everything doesn't fall apart, now you're dead. And so evolution never sees any of the beneficial implications of whatever that mutation was. But the fact that your parts are locally competent to do specific things, even when the environment changes, means that evolvability goes through the roof. You have this plasticity that you're able to tolerate all kinds of things and explore that neighborhood much better.
Wow, yeah, I guess I agree now that this kind of plasticity is at least some indication of intelligence.
Right, and this robustness seems to be a general property of biological systems. Paco refers to this in the context of plants.
So I like to say that, insofar as plants behave adaptively certainly that's a requisite. So, I mean, if your behavior wasn't adaptive, first, you wouldn't be here. In a sense, the fact that you are here means something, right? We are passing our genes. Oh, there's something we've got to be doing, which is pretty right. But yet, that might not have to do with intelligence. I mean, it's just a matter of evolution. It's just an adaptation. The guys that got the adaptation are the ones that are here. End of the story, right? So we need to add something on top of adaptive behavior. And that's the fact that this behavior has got to be flexible enough so not to be hardwired, such that in a soft wire manner, the organism, the individual, can deal with contingencies that relate so closely to its own history that cannot possibly be coded in their genes. So we need to move away from the phylogenetic considerations related to the tree of life to what matters to the individual, the here and now, to me, to Paco, Calvo, to you, right?
Yeah, great. Also interesting that they both point out that genes are just not enough to explain this kind of behavior. So being adaptive and flexible are good first criterions for intelligence, but there has to be more to it, right?
Absolutely. One criterion that many people also would mention here is generality. So it is not enough to be good at only one thing. But Paco is not too convinced here.
I would say that we need to operate the other way around and question generality itself. I think it's one of these concepts that we haven't been critical enough with. So when you do longitudinal studies in infants, in human infants, and then you see how they acquire competencies throughout, primary school and things like this, then you see, hey, it's not that they got the rule and then now once you get it, you apply it across the board. Because why would you say I can do 5 times 4 equals 4 times 5, but not the same when it's a big number? If you have the rule, you just manipulate abstract symbols. So you say alpha times beta equals beta times alpha. Well, we don't quite do that until we reach a certain age. So it seems that when you look, for example, at development, this solid edifice of the cartoon, in my opinion, cartoon understanding of generalization starts to fall into pieces.
One thing that is less controversial is that intelligent behavior also has to have a goal.
Intelligence cannot reside in the organism itself, because behavior, apart from being flexible, has got to be goal-directed towards the type of goals that matter to me. And those relate to the local environment. Hey, what's going on there? It's not just what's happening within Paco Calvo's skull. It's not what's happening in my head. It's how my head relates to what's out there. It's the coupling in between the organism and the environment that counts.
I see. But how do you measure if a behavior is actually goal-directed? I guess, especially in plants, this is not really obvious, is it?
There's definitely some creativity needed, especially since plants show their behavior in growing, which of course is much slower than what we're used to from animals. But nevertheless...
And in fact, most of the tools you find in the animal sciences can be applied, customized, but can be applied to plant research.
Yeah, but how does that work?
For example, you can just record videos of how a plant grows and then speed it up.
But we do time lapse. So we try to observe their behavior, their overt behavior, by speeding it up, right? Then on top of that, we register the electrical activity. So we insert electrodes and register the electrical activity going on within the plant. And just think of now one of the subjects we are right now time-lapsing. Imagine a climbing being. So it's circumnavigating, it's revolving around in circles to try to reach for a pole, for a target. Remember, goal-directed behavior. So it's reaching for the pole. The pole is there. It's a climbing being, so it matters for it. So it cares about having a support, finding some scaffolding to reach out there and do photosynthesis, right? So the pole should matter to it because it's a climber.
Interesting. But even with this kind of data, it's still pretty hard to interpret, no?
Right, but Paco and his team have a very interesting approach for that. Imagine you walk through a dark room in your house and you want to approach the light switch, but then you stumble over a toy on the floor.
And then boom, you just bump into it. You can see it, right? It's different from the type of movement, exploratory movement that you make when you try to reach the switch on the wall to switch the light on. So you are kind of gently because you know it's all over there. So this controlled approach, this controlled maneuver is something that you can tell out of velocities, rates of acceleration, this type of information. And that's the type of information that you can record when you are time-lapsing the plant. So if there is the pole and then you just see the plant simply growing and growing and growing and then bumps onto the pole, that's the type of reactive behavior we said. Reactive, not proactive. Say, oh, I bumped into, oh, thank God. That's very different from growing in a controlled manner towards the pole. So if we can tell that out of the analysis of the time-lapse footage, plus the electrical activity being recorded with the electrodes, so you can see what's happening within the plant, and you can find correlates with the overt behavioral activity as it emerges on the time-lapse footage.
Yeah, that's interesting. But what does the data now say?
So the jury's still out on that one. The data is not completely conclusive yet.
If you ask, what have you found already? I would say none so far, because I want to be extra careful. And this means that when you are after a phenomenon that is so wild, the burden of proof is on yours. So I assume the burden of proof. And this means I don't want to fall prey of a confirmation bias. And I see that happening all over the place. And I think that's dangerous, because if you get overexcited and you try to see intelligence all over the place, then you run the risk of shooting yourself on the foot.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense to be cautious there. And yeah, I'm excited what we're going to hear about that in the future. So going back to cell collectives, can you see some goal-directedness in there?
Mike and his group actually have a lot of fascinating examples for how amazingly general and goal-directed cells can be. My favorite is probably this one.
In the salamander, there is a tube called a kidney tubule. Think about it's like a it's a tube. Okay, if you take a cross section through this tube, you see that in a normal salamander there are 8 to 10 cells that make up the diameter of the circumference of this tube. Okay, they go around. So in order to do this, the cells have to communicate with each other. And they communicate with each other, and they make this tubule, right? And people say, the genetics tells the cells what to do. Okay, so one cool thing you can do with newts is that you can make what's called polyploid newts, which means that they will have multiple times the normal number of chromosomes. So if the normal number of genetic material is 2n, you can have 4n, 6n, 8n newts, right? So every cell has more chromosomes. When that happens, the cells get really huge. Okay, the cells get bigger and bigger. The more genetic material, the more bigger the cells get. But the animal stays the same size. So now that's interesting. What does that mean? That means that every structure has to be made of fewer number of cells. So if you take a cross-section of a tubule of a 4n newt, you will see that instead of 8 to 10 cells, there are now 4 to 5 cells. That's already fascinating, right? Amazing, the cells are making up for this. But here's the best part. It gets even better than that. The best part is that if you make enormous cells, that are like an 8n newt, what does the kidney tubule look like? One single cell bends around itself, leaving a hole in the middle, and makes a tubule. Now, why is this amazing? Because now, no more cell-to-cell communication. Now the molecular mechanism of how you did this is completely different. Now what you're doing is you're controlling the cytoskeleton so that the cell itself is deformed in a particular way. So what you have here is you have a higher level goal, the anatomical goal state of having a tubule, kickstarting different molecular mechanisms to make it happen. In one case, cell-to-cell signaling, in the other case, cytoskeletal rearrangements. So this is a system that if we had some swarm robotics that could do this, we would be over the moon. This would be collective intelligence like nobody had ever seen before. If you could say, here's my robot, I've now made every component 5 times larger. By the way, it still works, right? This is so far beyond our capabilities that, and so biology has this amazing ability to not only to solve problems, but to harness different underlying modules to get to the same higher level goal.
Whoa, yeah, crazy how adaptive this system is. And I can't believe that I never heard before of what kind of crazy behavior cell collectives can show. Yeah.
I think you're not the only one who's surprised by that, even though maybe we could have known.
On the one hand, it's amazing, right? And I'm always just stunned to see these things. On the other hand, we should have been able to predict this from first principles. Like Darwin should have already been able to predict this in the following sense. If that kind of thing didn't work, if your pieces were not themselves competent, evolution would never be able to get off the ground. Not that it wouldn't happen, but the efficiency of it, the time scales would be incompatible with what we see in the living world. Things are actually evolvable because small changes do not wreck the whole thing, right? And that's, I don't know about you, but when I first heard about the theory of evolution, the first thing that came to my mind was, let me see, I have some working device, and now I start making random changes to it. Are you kidding? What are the odds that, like, we know how hard that is? Well, what are the odds that any of this is ever going to be useful? The thing will be dead long before, right? And that's a pretty good argument, actually. And the reason that is not a problem is not just because we have billions of years, because evolution is actually very quick. It's because the parts are competent. So when you make these small changes, a bunch of stuff adjusts to it, and it's fine. It smooths out the selection landscape.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense. I agree.
And there are more things that most people might not quite get about evolution, especially when it comes to the role that DNA plays or doesn't play.
I want to be clear that I did not invent the idea that genes are not a blueprint. Okay, the next question becomes, though, is what do we say about where actually does anatomy come from? I want to say a couple of things about that. One is that, again, I think the hardware-software distinction helps us here, and what you can sort of you can imagine is someone gives you a bag of electronic parts with a piece of paper that labels each part and tells you how they connect to each other. So that's the genome. The genome, it tells you that's your bag of parts. It just tells you what your parts are. Now, when you wire up those parts and you turn on the juice for the first time, it does something by default. What it does is, because the parts were actually, they happen to define a calculator, you see a little 0 on the LCD. You say, oh, that's a default behavior. 100% of the time when you build this thing, you see the 0. Okay, and so that's amazing. So this genome gives us a very robust embryo. It under default normal conditions, it gives us this thing every single time, right? Now you find out that, wait a minute, this isn't just a calculator. This is a programmable calculator. Amazing. I can get it to do different things. I don't have to change out the parts. The parts are good as is. I can give it inputs, right? Stimuli, experiences of various types, and it will do these amazing things. It will plot, sine curves and calculate pi and do all these cool things. So one thing that we can understand from this is the idea that, yes, there is what evolution, of course, is doing a very good job of, is giving you hardware that by default gives you a reliable outcome. That's very important, right? Because embryos have to be reliable and they're robust and all of that. But the other thing we find out is that actually the hardware is pretty cool. Not only is it reliable, it actually is reprogrammable and can do multiple things. Multiple things like when we take cells out of a frog embryo, and the skin cells, when we take some skin cells out of a frog embryo and we set them aside and we say, okay, you are now liberated from all of the signals that were determining your actions in the rest of the embryo, what are you going to do? You can reimagine your multicellularity. What are you going to do? They make a new creature, which we call a xenobot.
Wait, hold on. So you're telling me that they're taking the skin cell of a frog and out of that grows a completely new organism?
Whether xenobots are organisms, robots, or something completely different is still up for debate. But yes, they're synthetic life forms, and their name comes from the African clawed frog, Xenopus laevis.
They make these novel proto-creatures that have a completely different behavior, morphology, all these different things that, and they're just skin with a wild-type genome. In fact, I sometimes give a talk on this. I spend 20 minutes showing these xenobots running around and doing things. I don't tell people what they are. And I say, ask the audience, what do you think this is? And they'll say, this is, you got this from the bottom of a pond somewhere. It's an organism, And I say, okay, well, guess what? We've sequenced the genome. I say, oh, fantastic. Now we'll get to the bottom of this. You've got the genome now. So let's see, what do we learn? I say, well, the genome is 100% Xenopus laevis. It's frog. I say, well, what do we do with that? That predicted nothing about what this thing looks like, right? So what that tells us is that what the genome actually gives you is a bunch of that are so cleverly made that in collectives they are able to deploy intelligence in novel circumstances. They can do different things. These cellular collectives can do different things.
Is it actually the cells doing different things and forming these new life forms, or are Mike and his team designing them?
Actually, both options are possible, but Mike wants to make sure that we give credit where credit is due.
We didn't edit the genome. We didn't provide any weird new nanomaterials. We didn't put in a scaffold for the cells to grow around. We're really taking advantage of the native competencies of the cells. But it's really important to note that what's going in here is not just the cells in their genome. In fact, one can think about the xenobot as not just the construct made of frog cells, but the entire system. The actual xenobot is the cells, but it's also Doug Blackiston and Sam Kriegman and Josh Bongard and I, and the AI that is running on the University of Vermont's clusters that was simulating the bots and telling Doug ways to sculpt them for specific tasks. And in that, it actually mirrors what happens to living beings as well, because all of us are in some ways being modified and hacked and behavior shaped by aspects of the environment, by our microbiome, by other beings who send us stimuli and signals. And so the Xenobot is a kind of collaboration. It's a kind of working together between scientists, AI, and the biology. And I think this is just the future of many more such collaborations.
Whoa, so that really sounds like the journey has just begun.
Absolutely. From what I can tell, the traditional artificial intelligence research can learn a lot from artificial life, something that also Paco is alluding to.
So we try to throw light upon issue of how to devise, how to design our toys with plants as a source of inspiration and not animal models.
And there are already plant-inspired robots.
Now, there are many examples of inspiration in robotics that bring this idea. They call them growbots, like robot that grows. So a growbot, for example, is something that can inflate from the inside out. So it's a pneumatic actuator, right? So now all the discussion has to do with those actuators, right? How can you build a robot that is being controlled? How? With a pneumatic actuator, you can see how much it inflates and in which direction. Like a plant, you can say, okay, if I inflate more this side and this side, it's going to turn left. If I inflate more this side, it's going to turn right. So differential pressure can give you directed growth.
So this is a new type of robot that solves problems very differently, not by moving around like animals, but by growing.
Interesting. So I guess that opens a whole other design dimension. Yeah, I'm really curious what kinds of artificial life we're going to see in the future. But one last question about the xenobots. If the researchers don't tell the cells how to arrange themselves and the genome has nothing but frog DNA, how on earth does that work?
This is still an open question, and answering it might lead to some deeper insights along the way.
Where does the shape actually come from? So I don't have a great answer, but I have an analogy that I think is useful. This is a thing called a Galton board. I don't know if you've ever seen it. Imagine a vertical piece of wood, just vertical like this. And what you do is you take a bunch of nails and you bang a bunch of nails into it at regular intervals. Okay, and then you take a bucket of marbles, and then you dump it in the top of this thing, and they go boom, 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 boom. They go, they kind of go everywhere. Then they land on the bottom. How do they land on the bottom? It's always the same. They make a lovely bell curve, okay? And they have cool toys like this you can get on Amazon and so on. And so no matter how you do it, each individual marble goes, however, it's stochastic. But then in the end, if you have enough marbles, you get this lovely bell curve. Fine. Now you ask the question, okay, where is the shape of this bell curve determined in the system? Is it in my description of the board? No. Is it in the nails? No. Do I learn it from staring at the metal of the nails or the structure of the wood? No. What you've done is you've created a particular machine. You've arranged the hardware in a way that manifests laws of physics and laws of computation that you don't get to interact with unless you have the right hardware. Once you have the right hardware, you are coupled to these powerful laws that do things that were never in your hardware directly. They are sort of floating out there somewhere, like the fact that if you know two angles of a triangle, you automatically know the third.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So intelligence is somewhere out there, and yeah, I'm really excited what else we will discover. Thank you so much, Solveig, for all of this input.
My pleasure.
Nico, so you've been, and I've been as well, asking, and we've been in general in this podcast, asking a lot of people about what intelligence is. Now let me return the favor. What do you think intelligence is?
So the main thing that I myself learned by asking this question, and also asking if something in particular is intelligent, that it says actually much more about ourselves than that thing in question. At least in our everyday use of the word, it really comes down to what we are proud of or value or find impressive. And as we've talked about previously in the AI episode.
So the third episode in our season, right?
Exactly. And I've already said there that what I'm impressed by has pretty much changed over the last few years, and in particular also during doing this podcast. And now I find it much more impressive if some cells can imagine their own body than if some transistors are beating me in a board game. But I still think that coming up with a proper scientific definition for intelligence is a whole different piece of cake. And I'm pretty happy that we have philosophers like you that are actually working on that.
Yeah, I'm pretty happy about that too.
Yeah. So what do you think then about, especially about Paco's take that saying such definitions are not really helpful and they might actually harm our research?
Yeah, I agree. I think there is definitely a danger of sticking too tightly to definitions, right? And missing lots of interesting options and possibilities of different ways in which, organic systems, but also artificial systems might count as intelligent, right? Perhaps we cannot have a nice, neat definition, one and for all, that applies, to everything. But I think we do need something that at least guides research, that tells us, well, we have these paradigmatic cases, these clear cases, like, humans and chimpanzees and perhaps, beehives. And then we can say, well, these are the things that are going on and that, are in common between all of these cases. Mm-hmm. I think we need something like that. So not, clear definition that says, well, these things count, these other things do not. But we do need something that at least allows us to say, well, when you're talking about intelligence, that's the domain in which we are, that's the kind of game that we are playing.
That makes sense. And what would you say are these general or like these common ideas or common principles that beehives, humans, and maybe super smart robots share?
Right. So, of course, I'm a bit suspicious to talk about that because I have, as you know, a stake in this discussion, right? So I have also done work on this question. So, on my own view, some of the important criteria, as you mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that we should pay attention to in trying, as I mentioned earlier, to delineate this kind of fuzzy domain of what counts as intelligent. These criteria go from things like generality, so being able to behave successfully in very different circumstances, right? So not being able to do just one thing very well, like, playing chess very well. That's nice, but it's not enough for intelligence, I think. We need something that can play chess well, can play, draughts, but can also pick up a bottle, can also, open a door, or, plan your holiday vacations and stuff like that.
But beehives are also not really good at doing that, right?
Right, but they are good at doing all sorts of other things, right? So if you poke them, or if you put obstacles in front of the direction in which the bees are building their beehive, they are going to be able to adapt to this new circumstance and find new solutions to that. Right, so they are able to, fight, to navigate to food sources, to communicate with each other about whether those food sources are, and so on. Right, so they do lots of things. You're right to say, well, it's nowhere close to what we can do. Right, we seem to be able to do things in a much broader sense. Right, so we have so many different contexts in which we are able to adapt our behavior and do well in those circumstances. And of course, bees and many other animals cannot. But then I think it's more a matter of a degree of generality, right? So humans have a high degree of generality. Bees have a much lower degree. Perhaps, baboons, chimpanzees, and so on are closer to us. And then we have, simpler and simpler organisms, or even saying simpler is somewhat misleading, but we have other kinds of organisms that have lower degrees of that. Another thing that I think is important, another criterion, is flexibility, which I think we also mentioned quite often in this podcast. Having your own goals, right, and trying to, and I think you also have thought quite a bit about this issue of goals, right?
Yeah, I think goal-directedness is particularly interesting because it already tells us that it doesn't make sense to look at intelligence just in isolation. It's always connected, and you also have to somewhat interact with your environment. Otherwise, there is no intelligent behavior, obviously. And what I found also equally revealing is that as much as intelligence doesn't just occur in isolation, it also never comes alone. So in our first episodes, we talked about the individual intelligence of humans and animals. But as Mike pointed out, we all kind of are, to some extent, what we would call collective intelligence. It's just like the behavior of a swarm emerges from collective efforts of the individuals. Our behavior is also the collaboration of a lot of cells, and they do quite some problem solving by themselves, as we heard in the interview.
Yeah, and I think also connecting to some things that we talked about in the previous episode, on episode 5, when we talk about humans, I mean, there isn't only, as you were saying, a sort of society of cells, but we are ourselves parts of society of humans. And as we discussed last time with Cecilia Hayes and Ali Boyle, part of our intelligence may be due to this fact. So to the fact that we are social, cultural beings.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think it's in general impressive what collectives can do, right? As we've seen, be them collectives of cells, as you mentioned, and as we saw also in the interviews for today, right? For these episodes, but also collectives in a different sense, right? Collectives of people like us, right? And what we've been able to build in terms of institutions, tools that then help us be more intelligent, right? So they are tools for us to keep improving our capacities, our abilities.
And might even be intelligent themselves. I mean, this is the whole artificial
exactly. That's the ambition, right? That at some point, the tools that for now are just helping us, right, be more intelligent and do more stuff, are going to themselves become intelligent, right? So that's a dream, I think, that lots of us are pursuing.
Exactly. And I guess what we talked about in episode 3 with Lisa Miraki and Oliver Brock is that we are already pretty far, and we have already a lot of tools in order to perceive that goal. But what might still be missing to some extent is something that already these very simple cells have, and this is this sense of autonomy that we still, with all kinds of machines that we have, we still tell them what to do. And I mean, we can do that, or at least Mike can do that apparently, but they don't really need our instructions. They just build pretty robust and pretty cool stuff by themselves. And I guess this is what we're still away from with artificial intelligence.
Right. Yeah, so yeah, I agree. I think the autonomy is very important, right? And it connects, I think, also to the point you were making earlier about goals, right? So one thing is if the system has its own goals, right? Another is if the goal is just imposed from outside, right? As you're saying, today we have systems that do what we want them to do. So the goals are actually ours, right? Of the designers or the users. They are not the goals of the system itself, right? What it needs to do because, it wants, or it needs to do because it needs that to, keep going on.
Right, and then there's a whole other debate to be had if we even want that. If we
robots
want to have.
Yeah. Well, maybe in the future we'll cover that. Let's see. All right, so thanks a lot, Nico. This was lots of fun and very, very fascinating, as you promised at the beginning. Really impressive stuff and really unexpected stuff, I think, today in this episode. And it's difficult to really figure out, well, are these edge cases, where do they lie in this, line, or is there a line at all, as we mentioned earlier? I think lots of questions still to be answered here.
Yeah, a lot of additional topics to cover, hopefully in future episodes.
Yes, for sure.
But this already sums it up for our not only episode, but the whole first season of our Punching Card podcast.
Yeah, it was great having you, and having you as well, listeners, to join us for these episodes, for this first season. So I'm looking forward to keep working on these questions and perhaps also in this podcast with you. So that's all for our first season. Thanks for joining us here at Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent.
And now, time for some fun facts. It's been a few months since we recorded the interview with Levin. In the meantime, his xenobots have shown even more mind-boggling behavior. They can now reproduce. They do this by finding and combining loose cells into clusters that look and move like they do, which is called kinematic reproduction. We will probably have to come back to that in a later episode. Punching Cards, the podcast about all things intelligent, is a production of the Science of Intelligence Cluster in Berlin, part of the Excellence Initiative of the German Research Foundation. The podcast is produced, scripted, and coordinated by Aravind Battaje, Dimitri Mollo, Benjamin Lang, Nicolas Roth, Olga Shurygina, and Solveig Steinhardt. Editing by Valeria Beccattini. The music was composed and performed by Solveig Steinhardt and Dimitri Mollo, and mixed and produced by Aravind Battaje. You can find and follow our podcast on Spotify and Apple Music and all your favorite podcast platforms. For show notes, links to additional material, more information, and to contact us, visit www.scienceofintelligence.de/punchingcards or follow Science of Intelligence on Twitter.